Hi, this is David Fishoff of the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp. You're listening to Modern Musicology Podcast.
You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
What's up out in the music world, modern musicologists? My name is Alan. Welcome to the Modern Musicology Podcast, and I am joined by my buddies Rob Levy.
Yo, what's up?
Stephanie Seymour.
Hi, everybody.
And sadly, our fourth wheel, Anthony Williams, cannot be with us again this week. But we are joined once again by Stephanie's husband, Bob Perry.
Hey, everybody.
What's up, Bob?
Yay.
Hi. Glad to be here.
So Bob is guitarist, songwriter, singer, former member of Winter Hours way back in the 80s. And his most recent album is called A World Like This. And you are working on a music video for the new single, which is Love Is Running Over Me.
That is correct. That's the title track from the album. Yeah.
Yes. I love that song. It has a real, to me, like listening to it, it has a real like mid-period Fleetwood Mac sort of Bob Welch kind of vibe to it.
Wow, cool.
Oh, I
That
love
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
that was
thanks.
co-written by George Usher too, right, honey?
That is correct. I was just about to say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very cool.
There's no use waiting for a better time to come. Giving in to fate, giving in to rule of thumb. But the world grows smaller as the moon betrays the day. Love is running over me, can't get out of its way. I can't help wondering who I'm gonna be when the word comes down, surprises me.
All right. So this week, our topic is the Beatles, but not as a band. This is the Beatles as solo artists. So we're going to explore 4 different solo careers and the parallel paths and the divergent paths that they took. So let's start it off by talking about the end of the Beatles. When the last couple of years of the Beatles, we see a lot of different like influences and styles coming out of the 4 members, particularly the 3 main songwriters. And you already see solo albums happening. George has 2 solo albums out before the Beatles call it quits. And it's funny when you watch the documentary Get Back.
Oh my God,
Toward
we were
the
just
end of
watching
it-
some of that today.
Yeah, toward the end of it, George says something like, you know, I only get 1 or 2 songs per Beatles album. I've got enough written for like a dozen solo albums. So he was already thinking, he was already
Yeah.
like planning his solo career. He was like stepping out the door.
And John and Yoko were really encouraging him in that conversation, which was so sweet.
Yeah. So what do you think? How do you think that the 4 guys are developing individually at the end of the Beatles? What do you think are some of the significant like telltale signs of where these guys are going to be going once the Beatles end?
Like you see in Get Back, you know, George is definitely he is kind of disturbed and frustrated by his lack of input into the band. And he has a quote at one point where he said something like, you know, you have to play and work on 50 of Paul McCartney's songs before he'll even listen to one of yours.
Yeah.
You know, so I think you were right in saying, you know, he was definitely looking. He says in that interview that he wanted to put all his songs on one record, you know, so that he could hear them all at once and all together, and not have to just have a song here and there on a Beatles record, you know. So I think that's something certainly for George.
Yeah.
And just hearing, if you just listen to something, that's where he's going.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting because with George particularly, he doesn't start out as one of the songwriters. He doesn't start out very much with a true musical identity, and it sort of develops over time, and he starts to contribute more and more. And when you have things like Taxman gets picked to be the opening track of Revolver, and then Something becomes such an enormous hit, I think that he really starts to feel I have value. I have something to contribute that I'm not getting to contribute in this situation.
Definitely. He knew it and he wanted an outlet. Yeah.
Well, what about the other guys though? I mean, we and I'm thinking particularly of Ringo, because, Ringo, I think, is the one who has the least input as far as songwriting and song construction and arrangement and that kind of stuff. What do you think is driving him at this point?
I think when you watch Get Back, there's a sublayer going on, because the one Beatle you kind of come away from Get Back with a new appreciation of is Ringo.
Totally.
At least for me.
Me
right?
too.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Which is sad. You watch him when you're young, you're just kind of, oh, he's the goofy one, right? But I think when you watch him with Harrison, it's very vocal and it's very obvious. Ringo, the body language tells me that the wheels are turning in his head. And that I don't think at that point he's really sure what he wants to do. I think he knows he still wants to play music and he wants to go somewhere. I'm not necessarily sure he wants to necessarily do a solo album or what he wants to do yet, but I think he's got ideas. And I think that whereas the end albums saw, McCartney and Lennon fracture, and we saw Harrison get more confidence in himself as a musician, I think with Ringo, you see someone that is like kind of ready to step out over the ledge, right? And do his own thing, but he's not quite sure what it's going to be. So I think he's very sort of tentatively thinking about his next steps. I also think he's the one that's the least concerned about it. I think Ringo's kind of at this, and I've heard him say something kind of like this in interviews. He's like, I had my money, and he had, other things. He was out of the Beatles, he was the Hollywood celebrity, right? He wasn't, so he had sort of this other pop culture kind of thing going on, right?
Yeah.
And so I think he kind of didn't necessarily need it as a musician as the other three. That's kind of where I think his head is.
Yeah, he's already like launching into his film career. He was shooting The Magic Christian around the time that they were going into the studio to do that last album. So he's already got his other projects going.
Yeah.
Though, frankly, Paul had his solo career going too, because he recorded McCartney as, almost in secrecy. They were saying, I've read, because John was leaving. Nobody really knew that was going to happen, but John was going to leave the band. Paul was recording by himself, and so he had that done. He already had McCartney kind of done, and that's what, in a way, that's kind of why people say that album is a little bit uneven, and he was recording it by himself, really lo-fi, kind of low.
It's almost like demo quality.
Yeah. And they're saying, like, people are, said, Maybe I'm Amazed is the one song, which to me, that might be my favorite Paul song, solo song. That sounded really full and finished.
And I think, the other thing too is that they all sort of knew it was ending and they were going somewhere else. That's pretty obvious. That's the one sort of deal breaker. But I also think too that it was very important to all of them to leave the Beatles with some remnants of their friendships intact. That seems to be kind of a thing that they were trying to do. It seems like it was the hardest for John and Paul.
Yes.
But I think that there's very much an effort of trying to support each other and trying to, like, let's get out of this and then do other things. It's kind of like, you have that big test the last week of school and vacation's coming, right?
But that's why it was so sad when Bob was saying before that it was the press that really was creating and fabricating, one jab at the one and then one at the other. And it really wasn't them, but that drove a wedge between them. And then John responded to what he thought was a slight from Paul and Ram with his single. And then it was just this whole back and forth. And that's so sad, I think.
Mm-hmm. It is sad to see sort of that tension and that, you know, that whole situation kind of dissolve right in front of your eyes. And, you know, they're in those sessions that we see in Get Back. And, you know, we all know that George left for a period of time during that. And it's so funny because it's not a big blow up. It's not a big, you know, drama thing. He just says, well, I'm out. See ya.
Yeah.
And then doesn't show up again.
I know. And then they're like, John and Paul are the ones that are like, look, we need him back, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
But they were at that point really starting to go their own ways. And obviously after Abbey Road, they did.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about Abbey Road, you know, and that almost was a record that maybe not have been made if it wasn't for George Martin really saying, hey guys, you know, the way we're going to do the next record is we're going to go do it like we did records in the old days. And, you know, we're going to go to Abbey Road and we're going to make a record, you know,
Proper.
All right. So, you know, let's talk about the Beatles are broken up. And now they're all on their own, and the real solo careers start. So, like I mentioned, George had 2 albums out already, but one was sort of like movie soundtracky kind of thing, and the other one was these like really long, weird electronica kind of experimentation, which I absolutely love. Both of those albums, I think they're so fresh and so exciting. But then, right out of the gate, he comes out with his first solo album and the first #1 hit single that any ex-Beatle had.
Yes.
So,
My Sweet Lord, right?
Yeah. I mean, what an extraordinary song.
By far my favorite George song. And also, just a little side note, I was watching Hawks all fall long, and I played this. I must have played My Sweet Lord 150 times outside, just bird watching, because
Wow.
I was I'm still fascinated by that weird little modulation that he does in the beginning of the song. And I just wanted to be able to sing it by myself without even hearing it. And because it's not a natural progression, I think, not in my mind. But anyway, I just was obsessed with it. I love it. And that's interesting too about that song, about how he was sued over the similarity to He's So Fine.
Yeah.
Just another great song. That does sound like it. As a matter of fact, it does sound like it.
Yeah.
They said it was not conscious plagiarism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah.
Subconscious plagiarism. Interesting.
Yeah. So what are some of let's just jump into highlights. Like what is, you know, especially when you're talking into the 70s, all of them are very active. All of them are having big hits. And let's talk about Ringo for just a second, because I think it's important to note, you know, when you think of him as the lesser of the 4, but those first 6 or so years after the Beatles, he had quite a run of success. He had 10 top 40 singles in a row. 8 of those were top 10. 2 of them were #1s.
Was
he
Photograph
was on,
#1?
Yes,
Photograph?
it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He was on a serious roll.
Yeah.
And he himself said the reason that it ended was because he sort of lost his focus. He described himself as I wasn't a musician who dabbled in drugs. I was a drug addict who dabbled in music. So music took a back seat and he wasn't doing the thing that he had been doing up until that point. I think that's so interesting because you can see that almost sudden drop.
Yeah, and I think the thing about Ringo is that he created records out of the gate that were instantly more accessible than the rest of them, just to like a broader range, right? I guess I'll start with Sentimental Journey, right? Which my sort of rediscovery of that record happened in 2001. Or I'm sorry, 2001. I was in Liverpool, and it was actually the day George Harrison died. We were in a record store.
Oh gosh!
And they closed it, and we're like, "What happened? Did a Beatle die? Is that why everything's closing?" And they're like, "Yeah."
Oh
right.
my gosh!
So then we were driving back to my friend's house, and we passed the Empress Pub, which is the pub from Sentimental Journey. And I started listening to that when I got back home, and I kind of put it away for a while. And then I went and revisited it. I revisit it every couple of years. But the thing about that record, right, is that you see Ringo with George Martin, which is huge because it's a comfort level that he's starting with. And he's picking songs that are close to him, like Sentimental Journey. You can't really not make a cover of Sentimental Journey that isn't musically appealing to somebody, right? Mm-hmm. He's got songs on that record that, like, they're basically like, I guess now we'd call them easy listening songs, but they're like pub songs or like dance hall songs. And you kind of see him reaching back to his sort of like dance hall, school hall youth and playing records that he liked. And at a time when all of them were making very serious records, he's just kind of making this like really light souffle of an album, right? That we kind of dismiss as being, oh, it's Ringo. But when you listen to it from start to finish, it's not bad. It's way more cohesive than some of the stuff Lennon would do, in terms of song to song, right? But I think a large part of that is having Harrison around.
I was just going to say that.
George Martin around. But I think the photograph.
Oh, well, George Harrison, though, too.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you get to the photograph, which Harrison basically crafted that into a #1 record for him, right?
And also before that, It Don't Come Easy, the single,
Yeah, and I think you see Ringo later in '74 with Goodnight Vienna. He's got Elton John, he's got Lennon, he's got Billy Preston on it.
Yep.
And then he's got a record, the self-titled Ringo record, which is like 73. That's basically the closest we get to a Beatles reunion record. Because he's got all the Beatles on it, right? Yeah. Which is, so, he managed to, I think, keep the relationship with each other Beatle perfectly intact, which I think helped him musically.
That's interesting.
I think he's able to make a record with George Harrison, right? And take it to Paul and say, what do you think? I think he's able to make a record with Paul and take it to Lennon and say, what do you think? So I think outside of being the intermediary between all the Beatles, I also think he's kind of like the musical axis, right? Mm-hmm. He's kind of like the guy that can go to see the rest of them, sort of feed off of what they're doing and see what they're doing. So his career in the early 70s is just really fascinating. I think you're completely right, Alan. He's doing some really interesting things. Now, he's not taking a ton of risks. He's playing it really safe, right?
Yes, the blues, that bluesy album, the second one, where it's just kind of, like rock and blues kind of stuff, country and blues. Yeah,
but he's going back to what he likes.
Yes, that's what I mean. Like
he's doing it with he's doing it with a sense of like unabashed love that the other ones don't necessarily completely do, right? I think he goes back to blues in the way that later John would go back to like Little Richard, right? Or George would go back to, some of the other artists he'd like. But he, I think it's sort of just tragic how dismissed those early records are, those early 4 or 5 records he did. Because people's like, oh, he's the drummer. But he doesn't have the strongest voice.
Right.
But I think what he managed to do, because later, he's making albums with Richard Perry, no relation to Bob. He's making records with producers that make his voice work with the music. And I think I think he gave himself over artistically more to his producers than the others did. I think he basically said, look, I know what my weaknesses are, and I'm willing. He was not the control freak he was, and I think that helped him out of the gate. Like you said, when the drugs hit, all bets are off and he's nuts. But I am happy to say, though, too, that having listened to the EPs over the last couple of years, he's kind of had a renaissance, which is nice.
And speaking of, how he was more consistent, I'm going to say, honey, you were saying, Bob, you were saying how John, for example, was kind of all over the place, right?
Well, like Rob alluded to earlier, John's catalog, as a solo Beatle, is sporadic, at best. And there's a lot of, there's not a cohesiveness in the albums. There's a standout track here and there, but on the most part, I'm not a huge fan of John Lennon's solo, most of his solo records, Plastic Ono Band is a great record. I love Walls and Bridges, after the Lost Weekend period, sort of at the end of that, where he gets with Elton John. They have a big hit with that, and Elton John actually brings him, to Madison Square Garden and gets him, kind of back in the limelight a little bit. But yeah, like John.
It was more hit or miss.
Yeah, and I think, making records with Yoko was not the smartest career move.
Well, I mean, I don't think he cared.
I know,
and I
right.
have to say, in defense
I get
of
it.
Yoko.
No,
I mean,
get it.
no. I'm saying I don't think like Yoko's. I think she's expressing herself in the way that she does, and they were doing it together, and they obviously enjoyed doing that. And so I find that was, when I look back on it, I appreciate it more than I did then, I think.
Yeah.
But then, at some point he really did start delving into his own songwriting more clearly. And, when we're at Double Fantasy, it's just, that's one of the best records of all time, I feel like.
I do think that his half of Double Fantasy is incredible. I think it's one of the strongest things he ever did. And I think if you had to go out the way he went out really strong.
And Milk and Honey was also strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Agreed.
But I listened to something like Sometime in New York City, which is rushed and hurried and just sort of like a mess, right? And I'm like, man, someone get a really, really good string of production dates in a row, because you can feel the art is there. You can feel it, right? It's like, it's there. It's trying to come out, but it's not coming out. And it's like, you want to bang your head against a wall. And I think Yoko was really good at getting him focused when they were making music. And I think that she had a really good way of making him feel more creatively energized.
Rob, go ahead. No, go ahead. Finish your point.
But I think that at the time that those records were made, people did not understand the dynamic of John and Yoko the way that we do now. And I think that's the benefit of hindsight.
And you can see it, I have to say, and this is something that I first said when I saw Get Back, the documentary.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think she was doing anything crazy or weird. She was completely supportive and helping him. And I think that the band knew it too, because she was kind of keeping him together and on track.
And in the same way that the media fueled the Paul John thing, they totally threw fire on the Yoko Ono thing. Yes. And it's pure, a lot of it's racism, a lot of it's not understanding her art, some of it's sexism. And it's just, they wanted, I think that near the end, they wanted to tear somebody down, and Lennon was the guy that they for some reason decided they were going to do.
Yeah.
I started listening to top 40 music 73-ish. And so, like I've said before on this show, the Beatles to me were 4 individual guys. I knew who all the Beatles were. I knew the name the Beatles, but they were all like the guys who did Photograph and the No song.
Really?
And, that kind of, that's where I knew them. I knew them as 4 different solo artists, because they were all active in that mid to late 70s period, and they were all cranking out great stuff. But the one that really I gravitated to was Wings. And as I always say, Wings was my Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
And because by the time I started listening, you're starting to get those first big Wings singles, and then you get Live and Let Die, and then you get the stuff from Venus and Mars, and then you get the stuff from Wings at the Speed of Sound, and he is just on this tear of just cranking out amazing stuff. And so I became a Wings fan completely independently of any real working knowledge of Beatles.
That's a good point. I mean, I think I did too, because I heard my mom and my dad play the Beatles a lot. They used to play the hits and whatever. But then when I was growing up more in the 70s and the 80s, like that, you're right. Wings in the early 70s to mid 70s, even the late, like London Town with a Little Luck. I mean, that was, you just think of how huge that was.
Yeah.
So that was really through the whole 70s what was a mainstay on the radio.
Yeah, and I heard Wings through my sisters and my brother playing them in the house. And that's kind of like, I knew who Wings were. It's the guy from the Beatles, right? And then I just sort of thought, he's the guy from the Beatles, and the rest of them are just ham and eggers, right?
Acres.
Well, I mean, I was like 5 to 8 years old. I mean, and then I remember hearing My Sweet Lord when I was like 9. And that's when I realized there were other people besides Paul McCartney and the Beatles. I think, looking back I want to talk about Imagine, because it's the record that everyone loves by Lennon and thinks it's a masterpiece. I went to Catholic school, and we had a philosophy of religion class, and all the religion teachers were ex-hippies. So they'd always play Imagine at least once during the year and have us have some kind of philosophical discussion about it, right? And I remember looking at my teacher, and I raised my hand. I said, I know you love this song and it's everything to you, but the rest of the record is so much better. Can we listen to that? And man, I thought I was going to get killed, right? Because I don't necessarily think Imagine is his strongest single. It's the one that and Merry Christmas, War is Over is kind of what everyone remembers, right?
Right.
But I don't think it's the strongest record that he made.
You mean song that he made on that record?
Both.
Both.
I mean, both. I mean, I think that.
Yeah.
I think Imagine's the one that just sort of reached out and touched so many people.
It did.
And it grew a life of its own after he died.
Yes.
Right. But I think that there are other things on the record that are as good. But I also think too that there's other records that I think are a little more daring.
Let me just, before we jump to other records that might be more daring, I think I just want to point out that Generation X has an amazing cover of Give Me Some Truth. Do you guys know that?
Oh, yeah. Ooh, hold on.
Mm-mm.
It's one of my favorite punk cover songs of all time, actually.
I'm going to steal that for a thing.
Okay. Billy Idol, who was in Generation X.
Yeah,
oh, man.
I know who Billy Idol is.
Well, I mean, some people are... A listener might not know exactly who Generation
X is, exactly.
Yeah. But check out Give Me Some Truth cover. It's so rockin'. It's amazing. Anyway, on to more.
I know about Generation X. I listen to hip hop.
Rob, I think you're spot on about later, other albums being better than Imagine. Plastic Ono Band has Mother on it. It's got, Working Class Hero.
Those are my two. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great album, start to finish. It's one of the few probably that are listenable every track, right?
And I think the other thing too about, that record in particular, but Lennon, more than the rest of them, is the most willing to speak his mind about anything that's on his mind. He just didn't give a care. And that's what I think I love. I mean, as much as we talk about Ringo made records that were really accessible, Harrison was really pushing the envelope. Paul was making stuff that the everyman could love and really doing music that he was passionate about. Lennon was the one that was really pushing all the social consciousness buttons. But I also think he was the one that probably was feeding, whereas Ringo is feeding off of artists that are in the past a little bit with Billy Preston and using George Martin and things like that. Lennon is really paying attention to his contemporaries and feeding off of that. And how can I use that music to fuel what I want to do next, right? He's doing it with art, visual art, and he's also doing it with his music, which I think is really fascinating. But I also think that Yoko, by Yoko having the channels for John to different people in the art world and in intellectual circles, I think Lennon's open to a broader band of ideas to write songs about than the rest of them may be, just by the stuff he's soaking up outside of his life in the studio. And I think that's
Bob had a good point about George Harrison.
Well,
but Harrison comes a little later though with that.
Yeah, with Bangladesh and George did it in a different way. He wasn't as in your face about it as John Lennon. He was more sensitive about it. His whole thing with the Krishnas and Ravi Shankar, and all of that stuff was it came from I think a deeper spiritual place for him as opposed to John Lennon.
I think until you get to, which tour was it? Was it the Dark Horse tour? I think it was, where Ravi Shankar opens and then he has some other guest stars and people were like, he's not in good voice. Yeah, there was too much Ravi Shankar and George spent too much of the concert proselytizing, So I think that he does get heavy handed at times. I think that he and it's all like, it's not necessarily the social, woes that John is speaking out against, but it's spiritual concerns. And I think that he gets so passionate about that it sort of overflows from him.
But so many good songs came out of it, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely.
And he lived his life, like, again, honey, you were saying in the book that basically that you said he probably could have given everything up just for that.
Yeah, George didn't really care too much, it seems, about, being a musician, or especially being an ex-Beatle. He was more into, the spirituality that he found, and in every in this interview book that I just read, he is consistent in always speaking about Ravi Shankar, always talking about, in every interview from the early 70s all the way up until when he died, that's what mattered to him more than anything. Yeah.
I think it's interesting when you get all the way up to Cloud 9, and he does the song When We Was Fab.
I know.
It's such a rare thing for him you don't see him as the one who looks back and embraces that Beatles period.
Like the happy nostalgia, right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was such an interesting and unique song for him.
Yeah, and not to completely blow this into a completely different dimension, I think the stuff that Harrison brought to the Traveling Wilburys also freed him as an artist in terms of like, hey, I'm working with other people again in a working dynamic of working with other musicians. This is cool. And I think after that, he just really felt, you listen to his solo records after the Wilburys, and he sounds like a man unburdened, right? I think it gave him a little more juice as a songwriter, but I also think it gave him a little more energy to control all aspects of his records in terms of, production, and, he was really heavy-handed in the marketing and how they picked singles and how it went to radio and things, right? He had a huge fight about Got My Mind Stuck on, whatever. That one.
Got My Mind Set on You.
I always think of the Weird Al version right away but that was, the label did not want that to be a single. And he's like, we live in an age of MTV. That's the single, right?
Oh, that song too, that to me, I thought that was a Wilbury song. I mean, I think that he was, writing like that anyway,
And I think that's that Jeff Lynne influence.
Yeah.
Jeff Lynne was involved in both projects. And I think that he puts that rubber stamp of his style on both of those things very firmly. So he's in the producer chair in addition to being like co-writer and musician and stuff. And I think that Jeff Lynne template really sits heavily on both of those things, and not in a bad way. And certainly there are other those kind of collaborations too, because McCartney did the album with Elvis Costello, Flowers in the Dirt, which was produced and at least partly co-written with Costello. And I think that it was such a great collaboration, and it brought new sounds to McCartney's output. I think it's a great album. It's one of my favorite Paul solo albums.
Yeah, in terms of just Paul for a second, I really, there's so much to say about his solo career, and it's almost like where
so much content now.
there really is, because I mean, when I was thinking about we're doing this show, I was like, well, I'm just going to be on Paul the whole time, but actually, because you could spend
easily
days on Paul, but then we were playing, honey, My Brave Face today, right? And I was thinking, because is Maybe I'm Amazed my favorite, because that My Brave Face song is so great, and so even into the late 80s. I mean, I don't love all of his stuff, and I don't think all of it's as consistent maybe as I don't know. I don't think he's a super consistent record by record, but there are hits from the 70s, until the present. So you can't fault that guy.
Yeah. And even his records that aren't regarded as hits are in upon retrospect. His musical, I listened to his musical record this week, just to kind of go back to see, give my regards to Broad Street, and sort of like listen to it for the first time, like 20 years. And it's not perfect, but I see what he's trying to do. Right. And I listened to CCCP again, which I don't think I'd listened to for like 30 years. Right. And there's something about McCartney, with the exception of Wings, which you can always listen to, right? But there's something about when you listen to his records that you hadn't visited in a while that aren't hits. You sort of discover him in a new way when you listen to him that you don't do with the rest of the Beatles. It may be because of just the sheer volume of it, but I would, if when you're listening to this, try to find some time this week to McCartney album that you hadn't listened to in a while or ever, and listen to it, because some of it now it's patchy. The problem with him is he's patchy as hell in some of these records, but that's okay, right?
Yeah, not everybody. I mean, when you make 30 records, you can't, not everything.
I think the thing with Paul is that he's so musical, and that he stretches himself in so many different ways. That it's inevitable that he ends up that way. He tries everything, right? Like,
I would say all the way up to 2013. The album New. I love that album.
Oh, that record's really good. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's great. Save Us is really good. Queenie Eye, and my favorite song on the album, On My Way to Work. Oh my God, I think that's just one of the coolest songs he ever wrote. Okay, so I've got a question for Bob, and this is going back to Wings. The Wings Over America blew me away.
Me too.
And that was really my first true introduction to Beatles music, because there's that whole segment in the middle of the concert where they're playing Beatles songs. But the first time I've ever can remember paying attention to a guitarist tone is Jimmy McCulloch on that live album. And I think that still stands out as one of my favorite guitar tones I've ever heard. I think it complements the band's sound. I think it lays down the solos so gorgeously, and it's just this full, rich, but bright sound. Tell me what you think about that album and Jimmy's sound particularly?
Well, I mean, I love that whole album. I love the movie of it. I've seen it a million times. And I think you're right. That I think he's playing an SG most of the time during that, or maybe Denny is. But the performances on that are just so tight, and they're just so tight as a band together that they've got every little nuance of those performances down to the guitar tone, which is they're fabulous. It's stellar. Yeah, I agree 100%.
You listen to that live version of one of Stephanie's favorite songs, Maybe I'm Amazed.
Maybe I'm Amazed. Oh.
I think that that live version is like a huge, not that the original was bad. I think this is such an improvement over it, and a lot of it is because of Jimmy's guitar playing.
I'm listening. You could hum that solo in your head, without any time. And it is the one from the live version. I mean, Paul played a great solo on the original track, but it's it's opened up so much on that live album, that it's really, to me, that's the version of that song.
100%. Yeah. Just like when they released it as a single, later on, the live version of Coming Up is so much better than the studio version.
Yes. Yeah. The studio version,
it's okay.
It's a little lacking, maybe.
It's cute,
but it's good, but it's not great. Yeah. Yeah. Cute.
I'm gonna say on that Wings topic, all the way up to their last album, Back to the Egg. I love that album. That is probably my favorite Wings album, and no one ever says that, because it's usually, I don't
really know that one that well.
It's usually Venus and Mars, or it's Wings at the Speed of Sound.
Yeah.
But I love those albums. I love all the Wings albums, but Back to the Egg is just fantastic.
What was a single on Back to the Egg? Was there not really?
Oh yeah, there was a couple of things. Arrow Through Me is great.
Oh.
The first single was Getting Closer.
Yeah.
Which you'll recognize if you listen to it. It might not ring a bell by title, but and it's just got an energy to it that that the other albums maybe not lacked. I just think that this one built on what they had done before.
Now I have something to go and explore.
Yes. So what are some of your other highlights from solo Beatle careers? Favorite songs, favorite albums that we haven't talked about yet?
One of my favorite songs from All Things Must Pass, I got to say it, is the Bob Dylan track, the I'd Have You Anytime. I mean, the lyrics to that song, just unbelievable. And apparently, like George learned that directly from Bob. Like he taught him how to play that song. It's just a beautiful, beautiful song, as is that whole album.
I love Isn't It a Pity from that. And actually, remember, I don't know if you remember this, what we did that song during one of the Beat Goes On shows, honey.
Huh.
Do you remember that? We did a Phil Spector show, actually. And that was one of the songs that we did. But What Is Life also, that's another song that I think is so beautiful from that album. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, did you know about that? This was the first rock triple album by a single act that was ever released.
Oh yeah, and I was going to mention that too, because we're talking about, George has all this material that he's amassed and he's ready to step out the door. As soon as he does, he releases a triple solo album. And he's just waiting to get this stuff out.
Yeah, and the only album before that was a triple album was the Woodstock Live, but it was multi-act. So this was
that. And I do want to say that 50th anniversary edition of All Things Must Pass. That thing is which made me really that, and the documentary that came out a couple of years ago about Harrison really made me sort of solidify that he's my favorite Beatle.
Yeah.
But I think, that record's just got so many songs on it that can do so many things for so many people. Like, I love Apple Scruffs, right?
Oh, yeah.
Behind the Locked Door is great. I remember, we were, when we got married, when we were having people come in to sit, they were playing A Waiting for You All. We used that as sort of the come in and sit down. So like, so much of that album, is great. And like, there'll be days when you just like, I'm just going to listen to a chunk of it today. And I start with the back because that's the stuff you sort of never get to. And just literally, it's a record that it's 50 years old, but every time you listen to it with fresh ears. And I don't know how he did it. I mean, I know we talked about My Sweet Lord, but there's so much other technical stuff on there. And he's really good at doing quiet to loud at a time when people aren't really doing that. His records, like, they'll either start with silence and build, or they'll just sort of like have these really quiet sounds and then build. And not a lot of folks are doing that at that time, which I think is really interesting. I'm also a big fan of Ringo Starr's Goodnight Vienna. I love the Billy Preston stuff on it. But I just really like that record. I think it's probably his last really good record that he made for a while after that. I think it's great. I also like Milk and Honey. And I also, the thing that's interesting too is, and again, we're dealing with MTV. I remember the Nobody Told Me video when that was on MTV.
Yeah, me too.
When they premiered that, and that was like, I'd be sitting around with people and I was like, yep, these are the Beatles, kids. This is what I was telling you about, right? I'm sitting in a room with all these guys with like angular haircuts. Like, this is what I was telling you about, right? I mean, guy's a Beatle, but like, you don't think of them stretching into the video generation, but they do, right? It's really interesting.
Well, you also have the image of John and Yoko at the piano and stuff for Imagine, and because so they were doing video before video was MTV,
Yeah. I want to do one. I got one of Paul's solo albums, which just had its 40th anniversary, Tug of War.
Oh yeah.
That is a really good album. And Paul was on the Beatles channel on Sirius XM just a month ago, doing a big interview and talking track by track. And it was such a great interview. And it really made me, I haven't really listened to that album in a million years. And it really made me pull that album back out and appreciate it. And the song Tug of War is just fabulous. Take It Away is great. Here Today, the song that he wrote about Lennon's passing. And then it's also got What's That You're Doing, which is the other song he wrote and sang with Stevie Wonder, which is, I just think it's such a great, great tune. And I really love that album.
Isn't it funny though that Ebony and Ivory is on that album, and that we were discussing on a previous podcast episode that was one of the greatest misses of all time.
I wasn't going to mention that.
Well, you could.
Well, I think it's interesting because
No,
that
is.
song, it's got I love the melody. I love everything about. There's just the lyrics. I don't know.
Well, you could tell it's the first one of the ones they recorded, I think, too, because I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes when you have two creative geniuses in a room, it doesn't work the first time they do something together, but the second it does, right? Because they figured it all out. And like when you listen to his Firemen records, you could tell that there's a guy who's trying to reach in there and figure something out. I love the Firemen records. I think those are fantastic, and they're completely different. I think the other thing about McCartney that's really interesting is that he started his own music school in Liverpool. And Ringo's involved with it as well. And every year since it's opened, no matter where he is, he goes back for the graduation to personally hand the diplomas to all the kids.
Oh my goodness! Even
when he did his stadium tour years ago, like the last stadium tour I think I saw him on, like 2 tours ago. In the middle of that tour, he took a 3-day break to go back to Liverpool to go do that. So I think that he really gets the idea of building blocks for future musicians.
That's so sweet.
That's really, really cool. And when you go to Liverpool, the thing you will hear from different people and stuff that, knew him, either knew him growing up or knew his family or something, the big thing that you hear about him is that he's still a regular guy, which I'm not sure. I think Harrison's probably at this point still a regular guy to a certain extent, but I'm not sure the rest of the Beatles are. But I think him just sort of being a regular guy making records, or at least presenting that in his music, really makes you feel more understanding of records of his that he made that you don't necessarily think of as being super great. A couple shows ago, we were talking about when Paul McCartney met Brian Wilson. And, you don't think of Paul McCartney excited to meet somebody. Right? You just don't think about it.
He's the guy that you're excited to meet. Right.
I think his everyday man kind of thing going on really makes him a fascinating artist, because a lot of his records sound like a guy who's making a bar band record. And those aren't necessarily the ones that are hits. And I think that's kind of an interesting aspect of them.
I'll tell you, I think one of my favorite records by Paul McCartney is Ram, actually, and there are so many great songs on that record. And our friends that are in Murderers Row do a great tribute of this. That it's just out of control. But not even though the ones that really stand out, like Uncle Albert or Too Many People or anything like that. But Heart of the Country, what a great song! Like a great little ditty. It's a great record. And
agreed.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too when you hear something like Pipes of Peace, which we don't necessarily think of as the best McCartney album ever. It was huge in Eastern Europe. It's just it's weird how the records that we hear that aren't globally great, they're fantastic in parts of the world you do not expect them to be. Ram did not do well in Germany and Central Europe. It didn't sell, but it did better in America than it did in parts of the world and in England for a while. But Ram had sold better after 10 or 15 years after.
It definitely did, right? It had a resurgence and it became more popular after it was released, after it was released.
Which I think is interesting. I'm just fascinated by, how McCartney sort of just makes records he wants to make. And even the stuff that's bad now, I love listening to records of his that I sort of dismissed. So more than the others.
Okay, so to wrap this up, I hate to do this, but favorite Beatle.
Favorite Beatle? How can we pick?
George.
Gun to my head, George. Yeah.
Volkswagen. No, George.
Damn. I can't pick. I'm gonna have to say, in terms of them as a band, I will say that I can't pick a favorite, but I have a super new appreciation for Ringo because of the documentary and how he did really with his almost paternal kind of vibe and also his quiet and how he just observed everything going around him and then would just play what was needed to be played and made those songs so cohesive and just being himself. That gave me a whole appreciation that I never had for Ringo. So I'll give props to Ringo in that way, but I'm still not picking a favorite Beatle.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool. I mean, it's not like it's an actual favorite because I love all four of them for different reasons. And it's weird that I sort of gravitate toward George, even though Paul was my first love and the one that I spent the most of my life listening to. But and I love all of them.
Well, George has a certain, George can really touch your soul. I think they all can touch your soul with his songs, but he's really can. I just,
Yes, agreed. All right, we're going to take a quick break right now. We're going to pimp one of our other podcasts on our network, and we'll be right back in 30 seconds to wrap our show up. Stick around.
You know what now is a good time for? It's time for a promo for the Cosmic Pizza Podcast.
The Cosmic Pizza Podcast, you say?
That sounds delicious. What is that?
It's a delicious slice of life.
In every episode?
In every episode, where we talk about conspiracy theories,
cartoons of our childhood,
Star Trek quizzes,
movies that we've liked,
pod racing, general pop culture,
fantasy recasts.
But what we don't talk about is pizzas.
Right here on the ESO Network.
All right, we are back. So we got a couple of really sad passings that happened this week. Jeff Beck and Lisa Marie Presley. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob and Steph to kind of talk us through these, because I know that they were very important figures in their lives. So Bob, talk to us a little bit about Jeff Beck.
Well, being a guitar player, I learned about Jeff from my guitar teacher when I was about 17 years old, and I went to him with a record, The History of Eric Clapton, and I said, I want to learn these songs, and he taught me, to tell the truth or something like that. And then he handed me a Truth record, and he said, have you ever heard this guy, Jeff Beck? And I hadn't. But I took that record home and I was just floored. And to this day, I'm amazed at the how Jeff Beck has no equal at all. I mean, the sounds that he makes with his hands and the whammy bar on that Stratocaster, it's just unbelievable. And I've heard from so many different friends of mine over the past, guitar players over the past couple of days. They all say the same thing, that there was, he was, people throw the greatest of all time around, but Jeff Beck certainly was the greatest rock guitarist, and he managed to fuse together like jazz and rock in a way that was accessible to people. And he worked with George Martin on Blow by Blow, and that was the first album really that kind of made me want to explore a fusion a little bit more. So it really hurt me. And, I went down a rabbit hole of just listening to pretty much everything from the early, Yardbird stuff to we saw Brian Wilson and Jeff Beck at the Beacon Theater.
What a show.
Oh, it was great. And they did this mid-set thing where Jeff Beck came out with Brian's band, and he played all the lead vocal lines on guitar to like a set of Beach Boys songs with just with all the harmonies in the background. It was the hair on my arms was standing up during this stuff. So, I'm sure everyone, knows about Jeff Beck, but he really, he was the best, and the only thing to really say is that there'll never be another Jeff Beck, ever.
Yeah, that's the truth. Stephanie, what can you tell us about Lisa Marie?
Well, for people who know me, I have, I don't want to say an obsession, but I mean, I have a super great admiration for her and also for Priscilla. And I know it's weird to say, but I feel like I lost like a friend that I never knew, or like a little sister that I never knew. It's just a weird feeling that I have. And I'm so sad. But, even when I was younger, I sort of gravitated to her, and I don't know why. But anyway, I know if you see, there's some people that you can look at and they're in a situation where they're in some kind of great privilege she had that circumstance in her life. She was born into privilege, but everybody knows that anybody can struggle with, pain and depression and grief. And she was sort of plagued by things her whole life. She was like born into a spotlight that she didn't ask for. Her parents divorced when she was 4. Her father died when she was 9. Right there, that can cause a lifetime of problems. But she was abused by her mom's boyfriend when she was a teenager. She was a rather rebellious teenager herself. She married 4 times and went through 4 high-profile divorces and spent time battling drug addiction. She has 4 children, one of whom commit suicide in 2020, which was something horrifically, she just had to deal with that for the last few years. And it was I think she had a life of great highs and great lows. And through all of that, or through much of it, she made really 3 solid albums: To Whom It May Concern in 2003, Now What in 2005, and Storm and Grace in 2012, which I really feel like she was an underrated singer-songwriter. She had an amazing kind of lower range, bluesy voice. And you really could see her mature as a songwriter from the first album, from that single Lights Out, which was a great autobiographical first single, to the second album where, again, I think they missed the boat on that single that should have been Thanks from that record, to the third album, Storm and Grace, which was produced by T-Bone Burnett. And just to quote AllMusic, they said that on her first 2 albums, Lisa Marie Presley wanted to be a pop star with a difference. On Storm and Grace, she clearly would rather be an artist. And I think that speaks a lot to the growth of her songwriting. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for everyone who's left behind. But I know it sounds corny, but I really feel like she's probably reunited with her son and her father and her grandparents on the Presley and Beaulieu sides both. So it's just so upsetting.
You met her once, right?
Bob and I did. We went to see her on the Storm and Grace tour. We saw her a few times, but that was the last time we saw her. And we did get to do meet and greet and met her. And she was very kind. I was sort of a babbling idiot. Like I was just didn't know what to say, but she was really nice.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was rather reserved. Yeah, it was really cool to meet her.
Well, thank you both for sharing your thoughts and memories about those 2. So let's do our shout outs. What have we been listening to, reading, watching, consuming this past week? Robbie, kick us off.
I hate starting.
Too bad.
So I will say that the week that we're recording this is the weekend of MLK weekend. And, with that in mind, I've been listening this week a lot to Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" from 1971. It's a record that the whole thing is just painfully brilliant, right? And it's a record about Vietnam. It's a record about like racism and social injustice, and every single note that those songs are about from 1971 resonates today. And it's just sort of my go-to every this time of year, and you can always listen to it and it's fantastic. So he's amazing. So I want to go with that. Also, this week in 1990, the Sundays released Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic. Oh, one of my very favorite records.
Wow.
I saw them 5 times on that first tour, and they were amazing. And they were amazing. 2 of the times they ran out of songs, so for their second encore, they did "Here's Where the Story Ends Again." Right?
I wouldn't be mad at that.
No,
but they were great. They were in a time when everything old is new again. I'm like, okay, kids, where are the Sundays? Let's do this. Right? Just a fantastic voice in Harriet Wheeler. Just a great band. So I want to talk about that. Everything But the Girl have a new record coming out. Their first record, I think, in like over 20 years.
Whoa.
It's called Fuse. It comes out on April 21st.
Wow.
The new single is called Nothing Left to Use. Now, Tracy Thorn has made some solo records. Ben Watt's done some stuff, and they've both written books and stuff. And all the Tracy Thorn books are fantastic. You should read them. But this sounds just like you're walking back into 1994 and listening to Everything But the Girl again. And I'm very excited to listen to Fuse and see what that brings. So I'm looking forward to that. If you listen to my radio show, you'll hear it because I've been playing the daylights out of it. Also, this week, Bell and Sebastian released Late Developers, just a fantastic band. Just, they sort of carried the whole twee banner out of the 80s into now, and they're great. The songwriting, the musicianship, everything about them is just great. And then finally, I'm going to recommend another record that's coming out called Breaking the Balls of History. First of all, it's a great title by this band Quasi, who'd been around for years. Janet Weiss, who used to be the drummer in Sleater Kinney, is in that band, and she's an amazing drummer that kind of got a raw deal, but her drumming on this record is great. Everything she does on this record is great because she does some singing parts on it as well. But they're just a really durable, solid pop band that can also, get their hands dirty, and they're going to tour. So go see Quasi and listen to the record.
All right, Bob, what you been doing this week?
Well, interesting that you mentioned Marvin Gaye, because I have been listening to that a lot. The 50th anniversary, which is it's fabulous. But I also I started listening to Donny Hathaway a lot. I picked up an anthology of Donny stuff, and someone I had never really listened to much before, and it's just amazing stuff. Really, like a history lesson in that kind of thing. Also, as far as new stuff, there's this guy David Poe who's got a pretty recent album called "Everybody's Got a Camera." It's really great stuff. I was listening to a lot of Amy Mann this week because we had seen her over the holidays, and obviously was listening to a lot of Beatles solo records this week.
Right.
And that's pretty much it for me.
All right, Steph.
Well, first of all, I'm going to be a proxy for Anthony and give his pick of the week, which is Miley Cyrus's new song called Flowers. So that's what Anthony wanted us to give a shout out to. Mm-hmm. I like Bob, like all of us, I'm sure, have been only really listening to the Beatles. But I will say that last night, Bob and I went to see Richard Thompson and Teddy Thompson play at Outpost in the Burbs in Montclair. And as always, it was an amazing show. He was joined on stage by his wife, Zara Phillips, for some of the songs. And, Teddy also came out and sung songs with his dad too, but Teddy opened and obviously Richard was a headliner, but it was a great show. So we had a very fun time.
Yeah, it's amazing how much noise and how much sound Richard Thompson can make with an acoustic guitar and his voice. It sounds like a whole band playing.
It does.
They should put his right hand in a museum at some point.
That is awesome.
And what have you been listening to, Alan?
Well, this is kind of a downer, so I apologize. I had a best friend pass away this week. Oh, no, I've known him since high school, and we did everything together, and we were inseparable in high school. And we didn't see each other a lot after he went to college, and I didn't go to college, and then I went to college later. But we stayed in touch, and I went to Florida to visit family last January and then a week or so ago. And both times I was supposed to meet up with him and see him, and we didn't get to. He's been dealing with cancer for years. And so right after not getting to see him again this time going down, he passed away. Anyway, we were big Styx fans. And we went to see Styx together in 1981. And so I've been listening to some Styx this week just to, kind of like revisit some of that time that he and I were hanging out together. The other thing is I started another book, and this is by Susan Rogers, who is a producer and engineer, most known for her work with Prince. And it's called This Is What It Sounds Like. What the music you love says about you. And it's an interesting sort of like investigation into why people like what they like. And so it's sort of psychological. It's like, your personality sort of and your experiences dictate what it is that you gravitate to when you listen to music and how you process that. And I'm only about a third of the way into it, but it's really interesting, and I will report again when I finish.
That sounds good.
Yeah. All right, so that does it for us this week. Join us again next week when our topic is going to be that difficult second album. Bands who came out of the gate with a good, strong debut album, and then the second album comes along and it's either a masterpiece or it sucks. So we're going to talk about those things. It's going to be fun. All right, so let's find out where people can listen to more of us on the internet. Bob, let us know where you can find out more about you and your recordings.
You can find me at bobperry.bandcamp.com or on any of the streaming services. Look for me there.
And your Facebook and your Instagram page.
And your YouTube channel.
Bob Perry Music is my Facebook handle, I guess is what you call it.
There you go. And if people look for your YouTube channel, they'll see that new video when it comes out for Love is Running Over Me.
That's
Great
correct.
song.
I don't know what my YouTube channel's called, so I'm sorry.
It's just Bob Perry.
It is just Bob Perry. Unfortunately, there's a couple of other Bob Perrys, so you kind of have to look around. So, Steffi?
You can find me on Facebook at Stephanie Seymour Music. You can find me on Instagram at there_r_birds. And I have a website also, www.therearbirds.com. Why did I have to say the www part? I don't know. I didn't
Nobody says that anymore.
Therearbirds.com.
You can find me at http://www.
Stop. Well, it's your URL.
Right.
Oh, God. And then, of course, on all the streaming platforms.
All right, I'm going to interject on Anthony's behalf and tell you that you can find Anthony, especially if you're a Doctor Who fan, look for his other podcast, which is Watchers in the Fourth Dimension, where he and 3 American buddies are watching Doctor Who from the beginning in order, and they are up to season 13, which is the second Tom Baker season, and it's not going as well as people think that they would. This is the golden period of Doctor Who. And there are some of the members of the thing that just aren't buying into it as much as you think that they would. So give it a listen. It's a great show. All right, Rob, go ahead.
So MySpace. No.
Right.
Sorry, Steph. So I just want to say, too, you can find me on the usual socials, Facebook, Twitter, and Insta. But also on Post under Rob Levy, just under my name. You can find me there. Also, you can listen to the Weekend Justice podcast with NeedCoffee.com and a radio program I do called Juxtaposition. It's on Wednesdays from 7 to 9 Central. It's streaming online at kdhx.org. So if you have a life or something else you'd rather do, or maybe you're baking that night, you can listen to it on the archive stream and just check it out later and tell your friends. And even if you hate my show, at least listen around, because there's a lot of other shows that are just as interesting and lots of different genres. So explore that. And please, while you're out there in the music world, kids, support your local independent and college music radio station.
And if you want to find more about me, look for cosmicpress.com, KOZMIC press.com. And you can find a list of the podcasts that I do and the books that I have written and other books by other authors that I have published. Okay, so we will be back next week. Thank you, Bob, for sitting in with us. We really appreciate it. It was great to hang out with you again.
My pleasure.
And we'll see everybody in a week. Take care. Have a great week. Keep rocking on and do good in the world. Bye.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.